I call upon Manjushree. Manjushree is a resident fellow at Vidhi. She has also worked with the ministry on various acts and currently is advising them on digital competition law. Manjushree is going to take us through some key summary points in the report that Vidhi has published.
All right. Am I audible? Great. All right. So it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Manjushree. I'm a senior resident fellow at the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy. It's when you look around this room, it's impossible to not notice that some of the people that have been key drivers of what we call the DPI ecosystem in India today are right here. So it's a true delight to be presenting our findings before this audience today. I will start with what the research agenda and structure of our report is, and in terms of how we went about thinking about a governance model for the account aggregators ecosystem. We first asked the question, why is governance key? And before that, we asked the question, is governance really key? That whether governance is key, and if yes, and why is it key? This is the mental model that we sort of followed to first understand whether governance should play a role in the way the account aggregator system is going to scale up. Second, once we answered this question with a very overwhelming yes, we moved on to understanding or to take key learnings from what emerging governance models for DPIs in India and emerging governance models for open banking, open finance and data sharing across 13 jurisdictions, which are all across different geopolitical realities, have looked like. And finally, we put together a set of recommendations in terms of what is the way forward for an account aggregators 1.0. And I think this is where Orgo and I have constantly had discussions on, how do we make this both future-proof and build an intermediate actionable recommendations. So some sort of a consensus that we had here is that there is a broader vision that we want the account aggregators to become aggregator accounts, but how do we work with the constraints that we have today? In that the fact that today the account aggregator system has been recognized by the RBI, how do we capitalize on that to ensure that we start by building a governance framework, perhaps within the financial sector as an intermediate step to get to what we want to call the aggregator account 2.0. So the reason we started talking about governance is that the account aggregator ecosystem has been around for nearly 2 years now, and the kind of progress that the ecosystem has made is tremendous. But when we actually come to think of numbers, we see that in terms of consumer adoption, roughly 1% of India's population is plugged into the ecosystem. Now, somewhere this was a little concerning, or it sparked a little bit of curiosity for us, because with the myriad of benefits the account aggregator ecosystem has to offer, both to consumers in terms of easy access to credit and for our GDP, because unlocking financial data, especially in these volumes, can mean up to a 5% jump in our GDP. And how do we really achieve this? And for us to achieve this, what is it that we require? And we had two different questions that we sort of asked here, in that how do we ensure that this is valuable for an individual that is participating in the account aggregator system on an everyday basis, and what is the value that we can unlock for the economy as a whole? And both of this have one common answer. We need citizens to engage with the ecosystem to the best extent possible. And how do we really do that? We've identified 4 roadblocks to scaling DPIs. The first, and I think this is something that there is seemingly consensus across the room, in that there is a need to build a trust network in the way account aggregator ecosystem interacts with individual consumers. Now, this trust is pivotal in the AA ecosystem for 2 reasons. Let's first also take into account the kind of data that we're looking to share here. It is financial data. So consumer hesitance is almost a given. Now, this gets exacerbated by the fact that there are no statutorily backed grievance redressal mechanisms. There are no statutorily backed, there's no statutorily backed clear codes of conduct, nor is there something that allows the consumers to have their disputes resolved very quickly, although Sahamati is doing a commendable job in trying to bridge the gap between what a regulator is supposed to do for an ecosystem. Unfortunately, Sahamati's efforts today does not have a binding value on the ecosystem, and that may in some sense be a non-starter for a lot of consumers who are hesitant to begin to share their financial data to begin with. The second problem that we sort of identified is incentives. And correct me if I'm wrong here, because I tend to always think of data from a competition perspective, because that's what I'm very, very fond of. And we always talk about data as the new oil, data as the new sunlight. I don't know, God knows how many analogies are out there like that. But I don't think we've been able to come down to a mental model that allows us to precisely identify how do we really evaluate or put a price on data, even if it's not a price, how do we put a value on data? And this becomes important in a data sharing ecosystem, because what is really the incentive for an individual to continue to keep sharing data? Here there are two problems. There is one, a plug-in problem, which I think the account aggregator system has a beautiful solution to. You have a consolidated picture of all your financial statements in one place. It allows you to easily access credit. So in terms of how much value the ecosystem has to offer to you, there is long-term incentives. But in terms of immediate incentive to continually engage with the ecosystem and answer every consent request that comes your way, which is what is required to unlock the massive volumes of financial data that are hidden across different silos today, requires an incentive model that will ensure that the consumer has an immediately realizable incentive to sort of participate. This issue, however, I'm not sure is unique to account aggregators or is unique to any DPI. I think this is a question that countries across, regulators across the world are trying to understand, in that how do you really put a value on the kind of data an individual shares with a third party. The third roadblock that we identified is awareness, and I think Orgo touched upon this, so I'm going to sort of move through it very quickly. But the idea of awareness here is that the kind of potential the account aggregator ecosystem can unlock for a normal consumer on an everyday basis requires a consumer-centric advocacy piece that complements account aggregators' efforts today. And this also follows through inclusion, because inclusion and awareness are interrelated. In a country like India, when we're looking at digital literacy rates that are very different from what it looks like in the West, an inclusion that ensures that consumers that are not digitally savvy are also brought up to speed to the ecosystem becomes imperative. Now, to solve all of these problems, at least to some extent, we realize that a governance strategy is a key piece. It is required to put the public back at the heart of digital public infrastructure. And following that conclusion, we move on to studying the emerging governance models for DPIs in India and in the rest of the world. Now let's start with India. What has the Indian experience looked like? As Mr. Nandan was pointing out, for Aadhaar, we have a dedicated institution, that is the UIADI, that has been both a technical and legal repository, in that it is both trying to regulate the technical standards as well as as also playing the role of a regulator. So there is a dedicated nodal institution that has become the front door nodal body that is driving adoption of Aadhaar. And it is because of these efforts that we've seen the kind of scalability and the kind of adoption of Aadhaar that we have today. Next, taking from the success of Aadhaar, if we move to UPI, we see that there is a dedicated institution, which is the NPCI, but we also start seeing something very interesting. Here we see that there is a light touch regulatory support, although NPCI is an industry-led initiative. We had UIADI being an entirely statutorily created body, but when we move to NPCI, it is a market and industry-driven initiative, but there is an RBI appointed nominee on the board of NPCI at all times. So what we in fact see as a pattern is that we start moving from a completely public understanding or a government equals to governance understanding to a governance equals perhaps innovative models of public and private partnerships. And we take that further with ONDC, because ONDC is not just public and private, it is also consumer centric, it is also user centric. The fact that we're talking about user councils being put together on the board of ONDC, and the fact that the board members on ONDC is so diverse. You have people from civil societies, nominees from the Ministry of MSMEs. It is truly a multi-stakeholder approach that is emerging. So in terms of a story, if I were to map this on a graph, we see that we started with what we call a traditional understanding of government governance equal to government. And then we move on to a more agile framework that allows for both technical expertise and regulatory expertise to be sort of housed together. But when we move a step further, we realize that's not sufficient. We need to ensure that the user is going to be placed and should be placed at the heart of this journey. And therefore, we have a more user-centric approach that we see emerging with newer regulatory models such as ONDC. Now, let's see what's happening internationally. Now, we've looked at 13 different examples. For the sake of brevity, I've just summed them down to these here. What's really interesting about the models that we've put together here, that's United Kingdom, Philippines, Estonia, and United States, is that these 4 countries actually have a nodal body that is driving the adoption of open banking, open finance, or data exchange. Now, the presence or the need for a nodal body becomes all the more evident and all the more important, especially when one is looking to scale across borders, because there is an accountable institution that one can rely on or pin accountability on, especially when a technology is leaving the garb of the law that it was allowed to operate within a country and is trying to move to another jurisdiction. Such a dedicated body becomes extremely important also for cross-sectoral adoption, which is what we hope account aggregators will become with an aggregator account soon to speak. So with United Kingdom, Philippines, Estonia, and United States, it's clear that there is a move to ensure a dedicated nodal body that is driving adoption and governance. When we look at Canada and Brazil, these are 2 countries where these are proposals for open banking, open finance are relatively new, but the thinking about the fact that there needs to be an accountable nodal body is present. There have been joint resolutions adopted, statements that have been given out to put together a nodal body that's responsible to drive adoption. Last, we look at Australia, which is an interesting example because CDR was in fact started out to be a cross-sectoral right, but because there was no authority to sort of back it, or there was no institutional accountability for who was leading the adoption of CDR across sectors, there was in fact problems with mismanagement. So we have 4 examples where countries in a slightly mature state are in fact adopting nodal bodies to implement DPIs. 2 examples where we've seen that even recent examples of data sharing, data open finance and open banking have come with proposals of having dedicated nodal bodies. And 1 example, which is Australia, and that where the reverse was tried out, and that they first tried to come up with a framework for how this was going to play out without a simultaneous thinking of what a governance model could look like, and clearly it's led to mismanagement. So to sum up what we have seen with the Indian experience and the international experience, 2 trends become overwhelmingly clear. 1, there is a need for a dedicated body, one that is preferably statutorily backed, that is taking care of adoption and deployment of DPIs in a particular ecosystem, whether it be it account aggregators or any other DPI. And second, especially from the Indian model, it's evident that we are trying to move from a entirely government-held approach to where we are trying to democratize who gets to govern the digital public infrastructure, because a true distribution of the ability to solve also comes with a distribution of ability to govern. And this lies at the heart of a user-centric approach to governance. Now, moving to what that looks like for the account aggregator ecosystem, we've made 3 key recommendations. And just a rider here, we made these recommendations before the Data Protection Act. Again, I still have difficulty calling it the Act. Data Protection Act, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act came out. So we worked off of 2 models. First, in an ideal case situation, we would have account aggregators licensed as consent managers under the with the Data Protection Board. But with the constraints that we were operating at that point in time, given that account aggregators started as a financial sector initiative, what can we best do to harness the position that it has already carved out for itself? Now, that is a little bit of a logistical issue, but there's a principled issue in terms of why we may want to start with intermediate steps where we gain recognition within the financial sector to begin with. And this is for 2 reasons. First, as we've all spoken about, regulatory tussles in India are not an anomaly. We know that the regulatory costs involved with these kind of tussles are quite high. So in order to minimize that, we wanted to ensure that this remained a finance sector initiative to begin with. And second, simply for the network effects of the data that gets aggregated at the end of the day. If you're looking to unlock massive volumes of data, what the kind of business model that one ought to be prioritizing is to first grow tall before growing wide. And this is especially true for any business model or any sort of a platform that relies on data sharing or unlocking volumes of aggregated data. So for this reason, we thought that especially given that each of these data sets have a different implication to what they would mean for users, what they would mean for the economy at large, we thought that the first step in this case would be to have Sahamati or have a user-driven governance body that's established under the aegis of the Ministry of Finance. So I'll take you through all these key recommendations one by one. First, a robust data protection regime. I think we already have a great starter in place, which is the DPDP Act. But this is perhaps a starting point, but the need to truly engage with consent and consent fatigue, especially for a consumer society, especially for a society like India where the digital divide is this high, becomes extremely important. So while we may pat ourselves on the back for the fact that we have a DPDP Act, I don't think our work ends there. Our work will involve coming up with artifacts, coming up with techno-legal solutions to meaningfully engage with the idea of consent in a way where it remains meaningful and not something that becomes a default to consent fatigue. Second, we move to a purpose-fit and user-driven governance entity. Now, the reason we call this purpose-fit and user-driven governance entity is what we saw in the Indian experience. But there's a little bit of a reason as to why we may want this to be statutorily backed, or why we may want this to want the government to have some sort of a light touch role in this to play, especially for the finance sector in India, where close to 60% or a little over 60% of our market share is in fact held by public sector banks. So having a regulator back an authority or a nodal body will become pivotal to pushing these private sector banks to get into ecosystems like this. Otherwise, in the lack of a nudge, I don't really see how that is going to play out. So ensuring that there's a little bit of a government, peppering there then becomes essential. So in this case, we're looking at the governance entity to be backed by the Ministry of Finance. The Ministry of Finance specifically because when we're looking at account aggregators, I think we're looking at the securities market, the insurance market, the banking market, all under one entity, and something that can sort of consolidate all of them and ensure that regulatory tussles are minimized would be best done by the Ministry of Finance. And second, if you're looking for this model to become cross-border, if you're looking for this model to be deployed beyond the borders of India, the Ministry of Finance has the prerogative to do it far better than the other regulators within the ecosystem do, because the primary role of financial regulators is the security and integrity of Indian financial markets. So for this reason, we think that the Ministry of Finance is better placed to back this governance entity. Second, we also recommend that this entity has a true multi-stakeholder approach, taking inspiration from how ONDC is constituted. We may want to have representatives from civil society, representatives from different ministries, including ministries of MSMEs, DPIIT, etc. And also, of course, the various financial sectors that are involved in the data exchange itself. Next, we want the governance entity to establish clear codes of conduct that become binding on all actors of the ecosystem. This is pivotal in building trust within the ecosystem itself, and the fact that there is a nodal body in case something goes wrong. So a front door institution that fronts grievance redressal and also dispute resolution mechanisms becomes important. And finally, our report also lays out some considerations for what a legal structure for an entity, for a governance entity of this nature should look like. And again, we also struggled a little bit because the kind of structures that we traditionally tend to operate with are either statutory authorities or a default of a Section 8 not-for-profit company. But it may be time for us to think of something new, like a social impact company that allows us to blend profit making and the motive to do good. And this may be a way to ensure that the costs of running the ecosystem are also equally distributed across all actors of the ecosystem without necessarily one stakeholder picking up all the costs of the ecosystem, which we're seeing the NPCI sort of running into right now. And over here, we in fact recognize the tremendous work that Sahamati has already done in terms of putting informal codes of conduct in place, grievance redressal mechanisms, and the fact that it's driving adoption and is engaging so closely with all key stakeholders. So the next step to sort of ensure that Sahamati is the governance entity that is recognized by the Ministry of Finance is left to ensuring that the readiness that this governance entity requires is also built within Sahamati. Finally, the last recommendation that we have is to have a central facilitative body that ensures that all DPI ecosystems are able to talk to one another. At the end of the day, and I think I'm again borrowing from Mr. Pramod's words, that DPIs are never about the technology as much as they're about the ecosystems themselves. So an ecosystems approach to governance will require that the ecosystems are able to talk to one another. We have multiple DPIs that are scaling as blots of paper, blots of ink on a paper. Now it's our job to ensure that they are drawn with very nice and clean looking lines, and that is going to be achieved with a central facilitative body whose role will be to play the role of a coordinator across these key DPI institutions to ensure wider interoperability, ensuring that integration is in the lines with the larger goals of Indian digital economy, and more importantly to continually revisit the governance initiatives and governance strategies adopted across each of these DPIs, because again, with DPIs, governance and the technology sort of go hand in hand. If you're seeing one change, we may want to revisit and assess if the other one wants to change too. So to have that sort of a central facilitative body that takes the role of ensuring that DPIs and DPI governance are up to date and ensures that they're able to scale across borders becomes pivotal when we're looking at ambitions of taking our DPIs as our tech to the rest of the world. So these are our 3 key recommendations. Thank you so much, and I would love to hear from you in terms of if you have any suggestions or comments on this. And I think I happened to speak to a few people before at the breakfast table who were very excited about the idea of putting together a pricing model for how we think about data. And this is the kind of stuff that I would be open to chat at any point in time. So please feel free to send in your comments and suggestions at manjushree@vidhilegalpolicy.in. And I'd also like to thank my co-author Manvi, who's been a huge pillar of support throughout this project, and she's present here today, and she's done some amazing work on this report. Thank you so much, everyone.